The town of Dust Hollow had never been kind, but tonight it had something to say. As the last remnants of daylight faded, the crisp winter air bit through Janice's worn coat. The wind howled like a wild animal, tearing through the narrow streets of the town, whose houses stood silent and dark. The stagecoach had dropped Janice and her daughter, Annie, on the outskirts of town with no more than a brief warning. Leave by dawn, or else. Those were the words the driver had whispered under his breath, as if the town itself was a living creature capable of holding a grudge. It's your only chance, he had said before whipping his horses into a trot. Janice watched the stagecoach disappear into the night, its fading glow becoming just another memory in the cold, desolate town. She had nowhere else to go. The weight of their past, her husband's debts, the endless cycle of rejection, all of it, felt as heavy as the frozen ground beneath her boots. They were unwanted. But what choice did she have? You heard him, Mama, Annie said quietly, her small voice carrying the innocence of a child too young to understand the cruelty of the world. We have to leave. But where would they go? She couldn't keep running. Not anymore. Janice was a widow now, alone with her daughter, a burden no one seemed willing to carry. She had tried to hold on to hope, but hope had left her long ago. The town rejected her, and so did every place she had turned to in search of shelter. Harold's debts had followed her like a shadow, painting her as no better than the gambler who had squandered everything they once had. The wind picked up again, biting through the layers of her clothes. They were stranded. Then, as if the night itself was about to swallow her whole, a voice came from the shadows. "Looks like you're in need of shelter," said a man, his words cutting through the cold with an edge of authority. Janice froze, heart hammering in her chest. There, standing just a few feet away, was a figure cloaked in darkness. The man's face was hidden beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but there was something unmistakable in his presence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his gaze burned through her, even from the distance. Her first instinct was to run, but where? What else was there? With nothing but the biting wind and the desolation of Dust Hollow staring her down, Janice stood still. "I can offer you shelter," he continued, stepping closer. His voice was low, rough like the grinding of stone. "It's not much, but it'll keep you out of the cold." Janice's mind raced. She didn't trust strangers. Not after everything she'd been through. Yet, something about the man's offer, though blunt, felt like a lifeline. He wasn't asking for anything in return. His words seemed simple, practical, but there was a strange weight to them, like he knew more about her situation than she was willing to admit. "I don't have anything to give you," Janice replied, her voice shaking. "I've got nothing left." The man didn't flinch. "You won't need to give me anything," he said with a quiet assurance. "You and your daughter, come with me." His words were direct, almost commanding, but there was no hint of malice. He wasn't a man who offered charity. That much was clear. He was offering something else, a chance to survive. For a long moment, Janice stood there torn. Her pride told her to walk away, to keep searching for something better, something less tainted by pity. But her desperation, the fear gnawing at her gut, was louder than any pride she had left. "Please," Annie whispered, her small voice barely above a breath. "I'm cold." Janice's heart broke. The sight of her daughter, shivering in the winter air, was enough to crush her. She couldn't stand seeing Annie suffer any longer. Without a word, she nodded. "All right," Janice said softly, her voice raw. "We'll come." The man didn't say another word. He turned and started walking, his boots crunching against the snow. Without hesitation, Janice followed, her mind still reeling from the strange, sudden turn of events. Behind her, Annie's footsteps were light and hesitant, but she kept up, trusting her mother to lead her towards something better. As they walked, Janice couldn't help but feel the weight of something more than just the cold air pressing down on her. The man's offer wasn't one of charity. There was something darker, something she couldn't quite place, hiding behind his calm, calculating demeanor. But for now, she had no choice. She would follow him into whatever waited in the shadows. The darkness of Dust Hollow seemed to close in on them, and Janice had no idea what lay ahead, only that it might be the last chance she would ever get. And then, just as they rounded the bend in the road, the man spoke again, his voice low but steady. "This is your home now," he said, as if sealing a promise, or perhaps a curse. Janice didn't know what to think. She didn't know if she was walking towards salvation, or if this stranger had something far worse in store for them. But one thing was certain, she was out of options. The town had already rejected her. The only place left to go was into the darkness. The journey from Dust Hollow to the ranch was grueling. Janice could barely keep her eyes open, the cold biting through her bones as they traveled through snowdrifts and across barren fields. The man, Garrett, didn't speak much during the ride, leaving Janice alone with her thoughts, her fears, and the heavy burden of her decisions. She held Annie close, trying to shield her from the wind as they bounced along in the wagon. The cold seemed to seep into every crevice of her body, but there was something about the man's presence, though distant, that provided a strange comfort. He wasn't warm or kind in any conventional way, but there was a steady strength in him, something unshakable. After what felt like an eternity, they finally arrived. The ranch was nothing like the rundown shanties she had passed on the way, and the sight of it took her breath away. The sprawling property stretched for miles, the buildings illuminated with a soft glow, like stars caught in the web of night. The ranch itself stood as a fortress of sorts, solid, well-kept, and as far removed from Dust Hollow as one could imagine. The small cabin in the grove of pines looked like something out of a dream. Warm light poured from the windows, the inviting sight a stark contrast to the freezing night. The atmosphere here was quiet, as though it was a place meant for solitude, where the world outside didn't matter. As Garrett helped them down from the wagon, he didn't offer any explanation. His actions were efficient, focused. He wasn't interested in pleasantries. He had brought them here, and that was all. "We'll stay for the night," Janice said quietly, mostly to herself, but Garrett nodded in agreement, moving toward the cabin without looking back. As they entered, Janice's eyes immediately took in the warmth, the fire already burning brightly in the hearth, the small but neat furnishings that gave the cabin a sense of belonging. There was a table set with bread and honey, the smell of something freshly baked hanging in the air. It was more than she had expected. She sat down with Annie, exhausted and silent. Garrett had already moved out of the room, and Janice felt an odd sense of relief, though she couldn't shake the unease that followed her. The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion and routine. Garrett's presence was elusive. He didn't engage with them unless it was necessary. He left early in the mornings, and by the time Janice finished with the chores, he had already returned to his own tasks. He didn't make small talk, and neither did she. It was as if the space between them was an unspoken understanding. No words, just the rhythm of survival. Janice worked diligently, washing clothes, cooking meals, and cleaning, keeping the cabin in order as best she could. It wasn't glamorous, but it was more than she had expected. Annie adjusted too, though she missed the warmth of other children's company, the presence of other mothers. But there was no one here, no one except Garrett. He was a shadow, always just out of reach, never giving away any more than what was strictly necessary. Yet, there were moments when something deeper lingered beneath the surface, something Janice couldn't quite place. One evening, as she sat by the fire, repairing the cloak Garrett had left for her, she noticed something strange. A small pile of apples had appeared on the counter, their skins gleaming in the firelight. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight that made Janice pause. Why? Why was he being kind to them? There were no notes, no explanations, just the silent acts of someone who seemed to care, but refused to acknowledge it. As the days passed, this pattern continued. Broken spoons appeared fixed, firewood stacked neatly by the door, and a wool scarf draped over the back of the chair where Annie usually sat. Even Annie had noticed. though her innocence made her unaware of the larger implications. She would often wander around the cabin, playing with the small carved doll that Garrett had left for her, a soft smile on her face as she whispered to it like it was an old friend. One morning, Janice stood at the window, staring out at the vast landscape. The snow covered the land like a thick blanket, hiding what was beneath it. But in that moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was stirring in her. The silence had become more than just a need for space. It had become an uncomfortable tension. Why was he helping them? What did he want in return? Was he just being kind to a widow and her daughter out of pity, or was there something more? Garrett had never spoken about the past, not about his fiancée, not about why he lived so far from town. The town that had rejected her, just as it had rejected him. It was as though they were both broken pieces of something, neither quite fitting in but bound by something invisible. As Janice went about her chores that day, her mind raced with questions. Garrett had never asked anything of her, but she had never offered anything in return either. She thought about the morning the cloak had appeared, repaired and ready for her, and how he had silently handed her the basket of apples without a word. Something about it felt too kind, too personal. She found herself thinking more about him, not just as the stranger who had taken him in, but as someone who had a past, a reason for his quiet, careful existence. That afternoon, as she walked past the barn, she caught sight of Garrett holding Annie in his arms. He was sitting on a bale of hay, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he spoke to the little girl, telling her stories about horses. For the first time since arriving, Garrett smiled, and Janice's breath caught in her throat. The sight of him with Annie, his expression softening for just a moment, stirred something in her, a recognition, a flicker of understanding. There was more to Garrett Calloway than the cold, distant man who had brought them here. In that moment, Janice realized that there was a story behind the silence, a depth to him that she hadn't yet touched. She watched from the doorway, her heart aching with something she couldn't name. She couldn't help but wonder if Garrett had brought them here to protect them, or if, in some twisted way, he was trying to save himself. The barn door creaked as she stepped back, not wanting to interrupt. But just as she turned away, Garrett's voice reached her, soft but clear. "I'm doing what needs to be done," he said, though he wasn't speaking to her. The words weren't meant for her ears, yet they pierced her all the same. It was the first time he had spoken openly about his actions, and Janice found herself wondering if it was his way of justifying the kindness he had shown them. The next evening, when Garrett returned to the cabin after a long day's work, Janice could no longer hold back her questions. She stood by the hearth, her hands clenched tightly around the worn dishcloth. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and confusion. "Why are you helping us? We've nothing to offer." Garrett stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing slightly as though the question had taken him by surprise. For a long moment, he didn't answer. The air between them crackled with tension, and Janice's heart pounded in her chest. Finally, Garrett spoke, but his words were curt, distant. "I don't want your pity," he said flatly. "I just don't want the child frozen to death." Janice's breath caught in her throat. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice rising with disbelief. "Pity." Garrett looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then turned on his heel, disappearing into the night without another word. Janice stood there, stunned, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy cloud. She had thought there was something more, something real beneath the surface of his actions. But now she wasn't so sure. She watched the flames flicker in the hearth, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. Why had he gone to all this trouble, only to pull away when confronted? Was it truly pity, or was there something he wasn't saying? Her heart, which had dared to hope, now felt heavier than ever. And as the fire crackled and popped in the silence of the cabin, Janice couldn't help but wonder if she would ever understand the true nature of the man who had saved them from the cold. The days stretched into weeks, and the strange silence between Janice and Garrett only deepened. The harsh winter was still in full swing, with snow covering everything in sight, turning the world outside into a frozen wasteland. Inside the cabin, Janice found herself living in a delicate balance between gratitude and confusion, trying to make sense of the strange relationship that was forming with the man who had taken them in. The chores became routine, her hands moving through the motions of survival while her mind churned with unanswered questions. The occasional kindness from Garrett, such as a pile of firewood left neatly stacked outside the door or the basket of eggs that mysteriously appeared on the kitchen counter, did little to assuage the confusion she felt. What was it that kept him from being open, from showing any real emotion? Why was he so distant, even as he took care of them, even as his actions seemed to speak louder than his words? And he seemed to have no such doubts. To her, Garrett was simply the man who had brought them to safety, the man who had warmed their home with a fire in the hearth. She had taken a liking to him, and though Janice could see the distance in Garrett's eyes, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of hope. For the first time since Harold's death, Janice felt like they were in a place that could provide them with something. A fresh start, perhaps. Yet, each day as she worked in silence, trying to rebuild a semblance of normalcy, Garrett remained a shadow, never fully present, and that weight of isolation seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. One night, as the wind howled outside and the snow pressed against the walls of the cabin, Janice found herself drawn to the barn once again. She had heard the familiar sound of a guitar, its mournful notes drifting through the still night air, carried by the wind. She hesitated, torn between the desire to confront Garrett and the need to understand him. But the music was unlike anything she had heard before. It wasn't just a tune. It was a song of loss, a song of something deeper than words could express. Without thinking, Janice stepped out into the cold, the door creaking softly behind her. She made her way toward the barn, the music guiding her steps, until she found herself standing just outside the door, watching as Garrett played. His fingers moved deftly over the strings, the sorrow in his music echoing the loneliness that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. She didn't know how long she stood there, just listening to the melody that seemed to speak to her soul. But when he finally stopped, she couldn't stay hidden any longer. Garrett's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, there was no distance between them. It was as if the music had stripped away the barriers, leaving only the raw, unspoken truth of their shared isolation. He didn't say anything, but his gaze softened, and Janice felt an unexpected rush of sympathy. "Couldn't sleep," he said quietly, his voice rough from the hours of playing. Janice didn't know what to say. There was so much she wanted to ask, so many things she needed to understand about him, but the words seemed to get caught in her throat. Instead, she sat beside him, the cold wood of the barn floor creaking beneath her as she lowered herself to the ground. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, though it felt heavy, as if they were both carrying the weight of their own ghosts. Finally, Garrett broke the silence, his voice almost a whisper. "Used to play for someone," he said, his eyes staring into the distance, lost in the past. Janice wasn't sure how to respond, but she felt an overwhelming need to know more. "Who?" she asked softly. Garrett's fingers brushed over the strings once more, the sound of the guitar filling the air with a melancholy rhythm. "Eliza," he said, his voice cracking slightly. She was everything. Summer of '79. Her laugh sounded like creek water in the spring, all bright and clear. But something inside her wasn't steady. She hid it well at first, but it was there, always there, beneath the surface. Janice listened intently, her heart aching with each word. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Garrett to open up, to reveal any part of himself. She had thought him to be as cold as the winter that surrounded them. But here, in the quiet of the barn, she saw a glimpse of the man he used to be. Garrett paused for a moment, his eyes distant, as if reliving the pain of the past. I didn't see the cracks until they broke her, he continued, his voice low and heavy with regret. 4 days before our wedding, she, she took her life, right before the ceremony, in my father's orchard. Janice's breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words hit her harder than anything else he had said. She could feel the sorrow in his voice, the years of guilt and grief that still haunted him. The town blamed me, he went on, his words heavy with bitterness. Maybe they were right. I should have seen it. I should have known. But I didn't. I lost her, and I didn't know how to keep going after that. Janice wanted to reach out, to say something comforting, but she didn't have the words. Instead, she simply listened as Garrett continued, each word a step deeper into the darkness that had consumed him for years. I left it all behind, he said, his voice hoarse. The orchard, the life we were going to build together. Bought some worthless land out in the middle of nowhere. Built this ranch. Not because I thought I could start over, but because I couldn't face the town, couldn't face anyone. I thought if I stayed out here, maybe I could leave the past behind. But it never really leaves, does it? Janice felt her heart ache for him. She didn't know what to say, but she understood, in that moment, the depth of his pain. He had lost everything. His fiancée, his future, his place in the world. And in the aftermath, he had built a wall around himself, a fortress to keep the world at bay. She didn't know how long they sat there in silence. But when Garrett finally spoke again, it was with a quiet finality. I've been alone ever since, he said, the weight of those words hanging in the air like a cloud. Janice didn't know what to say. There was so much she wanted to ask, so many questions that swirled in her mind. But for now, all she could do was listen. She felt a surge of empathy for him, for the man who had built this life in the shadows of his past. And then, almost as if the moment had passed, Garrett stood up, brushing the dirt from his pants. You should go back inside, he said, his voice taking on that familiar hardness. It's cold out here. Janice didn't argue. She stood slowly, still trying to process everything he had just shared with her. There's so much more she needed to understand about him. But for now, she had learned enough to know that he wasn't the man she had first imagined. He wasn't just a silent, distant figure. He was a man broken by loss, a man who had built a life out of necessity, not out of hope. As she walked back to the cabin, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of compassion for Garrett, even as she struggled to reconcile the man he had become with the man he once was. She had come here to escape her own ghosts, but it seemed that everyone carried their burdens, their pasts, in silence. That night, as she lay in bed, Janice couldn't shake the image of Garrett sitting in the barn, his guitar in his hands, his eyes far away. She had thought that he was simply a man who had chosen isolation, but now she understood that his solitude was a prison of his own making. She wasn't sure where their paths would lead from here, but she knew that something had changed. She had seen the man behind the silence, and though she still had questions, she now felt the weight of his grief, the depth of his loneliness. It was a bond, however fragile. It would shape the rest of their time together on this lonely ranch. As Janice drifted off to sleep, the soft sound of Garrett's guitar echoed in her mind, a haunting lullaby of loss, and she wondered if either of them would ever be free of the ghost that haunted them. The days that followed Garrett's revelations felt like an uneasy truce between them. Janice still struggled to understand the man she had come to rely on, the man whose actions spoke louder than his words, yet those same actions were shrouded in mystery. Every small kindness, every repair to her cloak or gift of firewood, felt like an invitation into a world of uncertainty. She had lived her life in survival mode for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to have someone care for her without expectation. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Garrett was hiding something, some darker truth. His silence spoke volumes, and Janice found herself second-guessing every gesture, every word. She tried to focus on the tasks at hand, cooking, cleaning, caring for Annie, but her mind kept returning to Garrett. She could see him out the window, working with the ranch hands, his face set in that impenetrable mask, as if nothing ever reached him. He was a man of contradictions, kind and distant, cold and caring, all at once. It wasn't until the arrival of Vern Glay that Janice's life would take another unexpected turn. Vern was a man from Dust Hollow, and he was trouble, the kind that lingered like a storm on the horizon, threatening to destroy everything in its path. Janice had heard the rumors about him long before he arrived, about how he had once tried to buy Garrett's land, but Garrett had refused. The whole town knew about it, knew that the railroad was about to come through, that the land would be worth more than anyone could imagine, and Vern had been one of the many who had tried to take advantage of Garrett's isolation. But Garrett had turned him down, and that refusal, as it often does in small towns, had turned into a grudge that never seemed to die. Vern rode back into town one cold morning, his thin face marked by the hard lines of a man who had lived through too many battles, both physical and mental. He was tall and lean, with a scar running down the left side of his jaw, a permanent reminder of his past. When he spotted Janice in the square, riding on Garrett's horse, he knew exactly who she was. "So, that's the woman," he muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. The words, spoken quietly but with venom, set the stage for what was to come. Janice had no way of knowing it then, but this moment marked the beginning of a campaign of lies that would spread through the town like wildfire. The rumors began almost immediately, fueled by Vern's hatred in a town that had already rejected her. "Widow Drag's bad luck," they whispered. "She's cursed, just like her husband." Every time Janice entered town, the whispers followed her, cutting through the cold air, curling like smoke around her heart. It was as if the town had made up its mind about her family, about the very air she breathed. She went to the general store one afternoon, hoping to buy some bread for dinner, only to find that the storekeeper, Mrs. Denton, had locked the door when she saw Janice coming. "Closed to you," Mrs. Denton snapped when Janice knocked, her voice sharp with accusation. "You have trouble, not money." Janice stood frozen, humiliated, her fingers trembling as she turned away. The wind seemed to bite harder now, a reflection of the cold rejection she had just felt. She walked down the street, hoping for some sign of kindness, but it never came. Even the local bakery, which had once been a place where she could at least buy a loaf of bread for a fair price, had shut its doors to her. The rumors about her and her late husband's debts, about her being cursed, had spread so quickly that she couldn't escape them, no matter how hard she tried. It was as if the town had decided that she didn't belong, that her presence was an affront to their delicate sense of order. The worst part was seeing Annie's face as she tried to comfort her mother. "Mama, don't cry," Annie said, her small voice filled with innocence. "It's just a game, right? The people in town are playing a game, and we have to wait until they stop." But Janice knew better. There was no game. This was real, and it was happening right before her eyes. The next day, as Janice went about her laundry duties by the well, a young boy from town came up to her, his face twisted in mockery. "My mama says you're cursed," he sneered, throwing a stone in her direction. The small rock hit the ground near her feet, sending a jolt of panic through her chest. Annie, standing nearby, looked up at Janice with wide eyes, her lips trembling. "Mama, why does he say that?" The question cut through Janice like a knife, and she could feel the weight of every rumor, every lie that had been told about her. She quickly pulled Annie to her side, shielding her from the boy's taunts. "Go home," she said firmly, her voice cold. The boy ran off, but the sting of his words lingered. That night, as Janice held Annie close by the fire, her heart ached for the daughter who had to grow up in a town that had already decided her fate. She didn't tell Garrett what had happened. She didn't need to. The next morning, as she was preparing breakfast, the sound of galloping hooves reached her ears. Looking out the window, she saw Garrett riding in on his horse, his face set in a grim expression. He had heard everything. The moment he entered the cabin, The tension was palpable. His eyes locked onto Janice. And for the first time, she saw a flash of something. Something that wasn't just cold or distant, but full of wrath. Without a word, he saddled his horse and rode out of the cabin, his face a mask of fury. Janice didn't follow him. She couldn't. She knew that this was his battle now, and she had no place in it. What happened next was nothing short of a reckoning. Garrett rode into Dust Hollow like a storm. His reputation, the whispers that had followed him for years, had been enough to clear the streets as he passed. But he didn't care about the whispers anymore. He didn't care about the looks people gave him. He had one thing on his mind: protecting Janice and Annie. When he arrived at the general store, Mrs. Denton was behind the counter, her face pale as she saw him walk in. "Why did you refuse service to the woman under my protection?" Garrett's voice was low, but there was an authority in it that sent chills through the room. Mrs. Denton stammered, her eyes darting to the floor. She had no defense, no explanation. The weight of his presence was enough to silence her. Garrett didn't wait for her response. "I will not hear her name used like a curse," he said, his voice like steel. He turned on his heel and stormed out, but he wasn't done. At the saloon, he found Vern, the man who had started it all, sitting with a drink in his hand. Garrett walked up to him, grabbed him by the collar, and slammed him against the wall. The room fell silent. "If you ever speak her name again," Garrett growled, his eyes burning with fury, "I will bury you so deep, not even the wind will find you." Vern's eyes widened in fear, but he didn't say a word. Garrett released him, and without another glance, he walked out of the saloon, his steps heavy with the weight of everything that had been done. The town, for all its gossip, for all its rejection, had been put on notice. Garrett wasn't going to stand by and let them tear down the woman who had shown him kindness when no one else would. That night, a burlap sack appeared on the porch of the cabin. Inside was a wool sweater for Janice and salve for Annie's bruised cheek, a silent gesture of protection from the man who had declared his allegiance. There was also a note, written in rough handwriting: "I am not good with speeches, but I will not let anyone harm you or your child. Not now, not ever." Janice pressed the note to her chest, feeling the warmth of Garrett's words, even if they were few. She had spent so long fighting for survival that she had forgotten what it was like to be protected, to be cared for in such a fierce, raw way. And as she sat by the fire, cradling the note in her hands, she knew that Garrett's love, though unspoken, was the force that would see them through. He might not know how to say, "I love you," but in his own way, he had said it loud and clear. The days following Garrett's confrontation with the town passed in a cold, uneasy silence. The tension between him and Janice hung like a thick fog, neither of them knowing how to bridge the ever-growing gap between them. It wasn't that they didn't care for each other. No, it was something deeper, something unspoken. Garrett had made it clear that he didn't want anyone depending on him, that he couldn't bear the weight of another person's hopes or needs. Not after what had happened with Eliza. Janice understood that pain in a way she hadn't before, but it didn't make the coldness any easier to bear. It wasn't just the town's rejection that haunted her anymore. It was the silence from the man who had saved them. Annie seemed to sense the change too. She had been the one to ask, with wide-eyed innocence, why Garrett wasn't smiling anymore, why he no longer played his guitar by the fire, why he had become a shadow of the man who had once shown them kindness. Janice didn't have an answer. All she could do was hold her daughter close and try to push through each day, hoping that something, anything, would change. One evening, as the winds howled outside, Janice made the decision. She had to leave. She couldn't keep living in the limbo of this strange existence, where she was both wanted and unwanted, accepted and rejected. Garrett had done everything to protect them, yes, but that didn't mean he wanted them around forever. She wasn't sure where she would go, but she knew that staying here, in this cold silence, was no longer an option. The morning was still dark when she made her decision. She gathered what little they had, Annie's things, her own warm belongings, and prepared to leave the cabin. She didn't want to wake Garrett, didn't want to see the inevitable disappointment in his eyes. As she stood by the door, looking out at the snow-covered world, she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. This was it. There was no turning back. But then, as she reached for the door, she heard him. Garrett's voice was low, rough, as he stepped into the cabin, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "You're leaving," he said, not a question, but a statement. Janice's heart skipped a beat, and she hesitated, her hands still resting on the door. She didn't want to turn around, didn't want to face him, but she couldn't lie. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't stay here anymore." Garrett didn't speak right away. Instead, he walked toward her, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, his presence looming over her like a storm waiting to break. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. For a moment, Janice thought he might stop her, might say something, anything to make her stay. But he didn't. Instead, his words hit her like a slap in the face. "Then go," he said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. "Before the snow gets worse." It was as if he had already made up his mind, as if he had already accepted that she would leave. There was no plea, no argument, just a simple command. Janice's heart cracked at the finality of it, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. She nodded once, sharply, and turned away from him, stepping out into the cold. Annie, who had been sleeping soundly just moments before, woke to the sound of her mother's voice, and when she saw Janice standing at the door with her belongings, her face crumpled in confusion. "Mama, why are we leaving?" she asked, her small voice laced with worry. Janice crouched down to her level, wiping away a tear that had escaped before she could stop it. "We're just going to find a better place, sweetheart," she said softly, even though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. The truth was, she was running from the pain of being caught between two worlds, from the man who had saved them but couldn't let himself love them. Annie didn't argue. She trusted her mother, and that trust was enough to carry them through the next few hours, as they made their way to the small mail station on the edge of town. The wind bit at their faces, but Janice didn't stop. She couldn't. The weight of Garrett's indifference pressed on her chest, urging her forward. It wasn't until they were halfway to the station that the storm hit. At first, it was a soft snow, a gentle covering over the ground. But within minutes, the wind picked up, and the snow turned into a blinding wall of white. Janice felt the temperature drop, the cold seeping into her bones, and she realized just how unprepared she was for what was coming. "Mama, I'm scared," Annie said, her voice trembling. Janice reached down, squeezing her daughter's hand, but there was nothing she could say to ease the fear that had taken root in her chest. The storm was fierce, relentless, and they were too far from shelter. The snowflakes stung her face as if the very earth was rejecting her, and as the storm raged around them, Janice felt a wave of despair wash over her. How had it come to this? She had left Garrett, the one man who had protected them, only to find herself stranded in the middle of a blizzard with nowhere to go. Her legs ached, her body trembling from the cold, and Annie's small hand was growing colder in hers. It wasn't long before Janice realized that they weren't going to make it to the mail station, not in this weather. She could barely see through the snow, and the world around her seemed to disappear into a white haze. She tried to keep moving, but the wind was relentless, and her strength was fading. "Mama," Annie whimpered again, and Janice knew they were both at the edge of collapse. She didn't know how long they had been walking, but it felt like hours. The storm was swallowing them whole. That's when she heard it. The sound of hooves pounding through the snow, cutting through the howling wind like a lifeline. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, and through the white haze she saw Garrett. He was riding toward them, his face set in determination, his eyes scanning the storm like a man who knew what he was doing. Janice's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know whether to be relieved or angry. After all, she had left him. She had made the decision to walk away, And yet here he was, coming to save them. He didn't stop when he reached her. Without a word, he dismounted from his horse and reached for Annie first, pulling her onto the horse, wrapping her in a thick coat. Janice stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Garrett turned to her, his face grim, and without a word, pulled her up onto the horse behind Annie. He didn't ask questions. He didn't speak a word of reproach. He just rode through the storm, guiding the horse through the snow as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The warmth of his coat pressed against her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Janice allowed herself to relax, if only for a moment. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of cold and fear, but it didn't matter. They were alive. When they finally reached the cabin, Garrett helped them inside, the warmth of the fire almost painful after the cold. He didn't speak right away, but Janice could see the worry in his eyes, the fear that had driven him to find them. As he closed the door behind them, he turned to Janice. "I couldn't lose you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not again." Janice didn't know what to say. She felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. And for the first time, she understood the depth of his fear. He wasn't just protecting them from the storm. He was protecting himself from the pain of losing someone else. She reached out, her hands trembling as she took his. "I didn't mean to leave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was trying to protect us." Garrett didn't say anything. Instead, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if he never intended to let her go. "You don't have to protect us," he murmured into her hair. "Not anymore. We're in this together." The storm outside raged on, but inside there was a calm that Janice hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. In Garrett's arms, she finally allowed herself to feel safe, to feel protected. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she knew that she wasn't alone. They weren't alone, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days that followed the storm were filled with a quiet, unspoken understanding. Garrett didn't speak much about what had happened, and Janice didn't press him. They were both living with the weight of their pasts. But now, in the warmth of the cabin, surrounded by the safety Garrett had promised, there was room for something else, something that had been missing for a long time. For the first time in months, Janice felt like she could breathe. The tension that had gnawed at her since she first arrived had finally begun to loosen. The bitterness, the fear, the guilt, they were all still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but they weren't as loud anymore. They had both been through so much, and they had made it through together. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Garrett was different now. He still didn't speak much, but Janice could see the change in him. He wasn't as distant as he once was. There was a subtle shift in the way he looked at her, the way he interacted with Annie. It was as if something inside him had shifted too, as if he had finally allowed himself to care, to hope. He still didn't know how to express his feelings, but he didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than anything he could say. He had taken them in, protected them, kept them safe in a world that had already tried to tear them apart. And that, to Janice, was enough. The ranch, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like home. It was a place where they could heal, where they could rebuild their lives. Every day, as they worked together, Janice could see the transformation. The once desolate land was slowly becoming something more, a place where new life could grow, where hope could take root. And in the evenings, when they sat around the fire, Janice would catch Garrett looking at her in a way that made her heart skip. It wasn't the intense, burning gaze of someone consumed by desire, but something deeper, something that spoke of trust, of understanding, of shared experience. They didn't need words. They understood each other in ways that no one else could. One morning, as they sat down for breakfast, Garrett placed a folded piece of paper on the table in front of Janice. She looked at him, puzzled, but he didn't say anything. Slowly, she unfolded the paper, her fingers trembling as she read the words. It was a deed, a legal document. Garrett had signed over a portion of the ranch to her, the north paddock and stable. "It's yours now," he said quietly, his voice steady. But there was something in the way he spoke that made Janice's breath catch. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. She knew. He had given her a reason to stay, a reason to build a future here. It was more than just land. It was a promise that they could build something together, that they could make a life despite the ghosts of their pasts. "I don't know what to say," Janice whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Garrett simply nodded. He didn't need thanks, didn't need acknowledgement. He had done it because he wanted her to stay, because he wanted them to stay, and that was all that mattered. But there was more. Later that day, after Janice had finished her work, Garrett called her outside. He handed her a small weather box. It was simple, nothing fancy, but the moment she held it in her hands, she knew it was important. Inside, there was a ring, simple, silver, worn with time. It was Eliza's ring. Janice's heart twisted in her chest as she stared at the ring, and she looked up at Garrett, searching his face for answers. He didn't speak right away. His gaze was fixed on the ring, as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. "This was hers," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've kept it for years. Didn't know what to do with it. But if she were still here, I believe she would want you to have it." Janice's breath caught. She didn't know what to say. She felt the weight of his words, the depth of his history, and the meaning behind the ring. It wasn't just an heirloom. It was a symbol of the past, of Eliza, but also of Garrett's willingness to move forward, to allow someone else into his life. Janice blinked back tears as she held the ring in her hand, her fingers trembling. "But I can't," she started, but Garrett stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. "If it fits your hand," he said softly, "then maybe it's time for all of us to begin again." His words hit her like a tidal wave, and she felt something stir inside her. A mixture of fear and hope, of uncertainty and possibility. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she was ready for everything that came with it. But in that moment, she knew that she couldn't let fear control her anymore. She couldn't live in the past, couldn't keep running from what had been. If she wanted a future, if she wanted a chance at something real, then she had to let herself believe in it. That evening, after a quiet dinner, Garrett and Janice stood together outside, the night sky stretching above them, endless and full of stars. Annie ran around them, her laughter filling the air as she chased fireflies, her joy contagious. Janice turned to Garrett, her heart full, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. She felt light, free. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Garrett didn't say anything. Instead, he took her hand, his rough fingers brushing against hers, and together, they watched Annie dance in the firelight, her small figure a symbol of the hope they had found together. 1 year later, the North Paddock was transformed. What had once been a barren stretch of land was now a place of life, of healing. Janice had turned it into a haven for children with disabilities, a place where they could come and learn to ride horses, where they could experience the freedom and joy that had once been taken from them. She had created a sanctuary, a place where healing could happen, not just for her and Garrett, but for the community. Garrett worked beside her, building rails, smoothing the paths, teaching the children to ride. It wasn't just about horses. It was about confidence, about learning to trust again, about believing in the possibility of a new beginning. And they laughed. They laughed together as a family, as partners in something bigger than themselves. They had built something beautiful, something lasting. The ranch had become a place of refuge, a place where they could all find peace. The community had transformed too, once cold and distant. The people of Dust Hollow had begun to open their hearts. Mrs. Denton, who had once refused to serve Janice, now sent baskets of food to the ranch. The storekeeper, who had ignored her, now tipped his hat in greeting. They weren't perfect, but they were trying. And for Janice, that was enough. Finally, the day came when they were ready to take the next step, The wedding was simple, but it was perfect. There was no grand ceremony, no elaborate altar. Just a meadow full of wildflowers, the sky stretched wide above them, and the sound of birds in the distance. Annie stood by their side, a basket of lavender in her hands, her face beaming with joy. Janice wore a hand-stitched dress, made from an old curtain, and Garrett stood beside her in a gray vest and worn cattle boots. As they exchanged their vows, it was clear that this wasn't just a marriage, it was a promise. A promise that no matter what had come before, they would face the future together, hand in hand. "You once said you didn't deserve love," Garrett said, his voice steady as he took Janice's hands. "But love doesn't choose who is worthy. It doesn't wait until we're perfect. It comes for the broken, the frightened." He paused, searching her eyes. "You don't deserve love, Janice Winslow. You deserve me." The words were simple, but they hit her like a wave. In that moment, Janice knew that this was her home. This was where she belonged. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Because it was theirs. As they exchanged rings, the sky turned gold, and the town of Dust Hollow erupted in applause. The storm had passed, and the sun was shining. For the first time, Janice felt like she had truly come home. As the evening drew to a close, and they stood together beneath the stars, with Annie dancing by the fire, Janice whispered softly, "I'm no longer a widow with nothing left. I'm a woman who is loved, not for what I've lost, but for what I've found." And with that, they stepped into their new life together, ready for whatever the future might bring.